The National Wrestling Alliance (NWA) is an American professional wrestling promotion and former governing body operating via its parent company Lightning One, Incorporated. Founded in 1948, the NWA began as a governing body for a group of independent professional wrestling promotions, the heads of which made up the board of directors. The group operated a territory system which sanctioned various championships, recognized one world champion, participated in talent exchanges, and collectively protected the territorial integrity of member promotions. Prior to the 1960s, it acted as the sole governing body for most of professional wrestling. It remained the largest and most influential body in wrestling until the mid-1980s, by which time most of the original member promotions went out of business as a result of the World Wrestling Federation's, the WWF, now WWE, national expansion. In September 1993, the largest remaining member promotion, World Championship Wrestling, the WCW, left the NWA for the second and final time. The NWA would continue as a loose coalition of independent promotions, with NWA Total non-stop action given exclusivity over its World Heavyweight and Tag Team Championships from June 2002 until May 2007. In August 2012, the NWA discontinued its memberships and started licensing its brand to wrestling promotions. By 2019, the NWA would transition to become a singular promotion. In 1948, Paul Pinky, George, a promoter from the Midwest, founded the National Wrestling Alliance with the backing of 5 other promoters: Al Haft, Tony Stecker, Harry Light, Orville Brown, and Sam Upnick. The concept of the NWA was to consolidate the championships of these regional companies into one true world championship of professional wrestling, whose holder would be recognized worldwide. This newly formed NWA Board of Directors decided on Brown to be the first ever NWA World Heavyweight Champion. In 1950, Sam Upnick, one of the original promoters of the NWA and Thesh's Booker, was named the new NWA President, a position to which he was unanimously re-elected and held until 1960, making him one of the longest tenured presidents in the organization's history. Following the advent of television, professional wrestling matches began to be aired nationally during this time, reaching a larger audience than ever before. Rising demand and national expansion made wrestling a much more lucrative form of entertainment than in decades previous. This would be known as the Golden Age for the wrestling industry. From 1948 until 1955, each of the 3 major television networks broadcast wrestling shows, the largest supporter being the Dumont Television Network. In 1956, allegations were made that the NWA was an illegal monopoly blocking competition. An investigation led by the U.S. Department of Justice resulted in the NWA Consent Decree of 1956. Several promoters would leave the organization during this time, with some managing to find niches in the United States. In 1957, Montreal promoter Eddie Quinn walked out of the August NWA meeting in St. Louis, having fallen out with Upnick over a number of issues. At the time Quinn walked out, a wrestler of his name Drew Carpentier was involved in an angle where he and Lou Thesz were both being presented around the NWA as world champion after Carpentier had a disputed win over Thesz on June 14, 1957. As the 1950s came to a close, professional wrestling was losing television ratings, and soon TV stations dropped most wrestling shows from their lineups. The remaining televised wrestling promoters had small, local syndicated shows, which aired as late-night filler programming. Promoters started using localized television by purchasing airtime from rival territories, at the consequence of putting some of them out of business. On January 24, 1963, at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, Lou Thesz defeated Buddy Rogers in a one-fall match and was declared NWA World Heavyweight Champion for the third and final time. However, after the event, Vincent J. McMahon and Toots Mondt from the Capital Wrestling Corporation promotion in the Northeast Territory refused to recognize the title change since Thesz as the NWA World Heavyweight Champion was not a strong draw in their territory. They then withdrew CWC from the NWA. As a result, McMahon and Mondt formed the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, later to be known as WWE, with Rogers as its first world champion in April 1963. Although both Gainey and McMahon promoted their own world champions, their promotions continued to have representatives on the NWA board of directors and regularly exchanged talent with NWA Promotions during this time. Wrestling's popularity continued to decline in the 1970s. The WWF quietly rejoined the NWA in 1971 after their biggest draw, Bruno Sammartino, left the promotion. While still an NWA member in 1979, they changed their name from Worldwide Wrestling Federation, the WWF, to World Wrestling Federation, the WWF. At some point during the decade, Muchnick reportedly declared Atlanta, Georgia is the leading wrestling city for its drawing capacity and near-capacity crowds at the City Auditorium or the Omni every Friday, while the American Wrestling Association, the AW, and Worldwide Wrestling Federation / World Wrestling Federation both faltered during the 1970s. The NWA once again took over as the top promotion and gained huge dominance with their program, Georgia Championship Wrestling, which would become the first nationally broadcast wrestling program on cable television through then Superstation TBS in 1979. They brought in Gordon Soley, dubbed the Walter Cronkite of professional wrestling, from former NWA President Eddie Graham's Championship Wrestling from Florida Territory, to be lead commentator and host.
World Championship Wrestling WCW is a defunct American professional wrestling promotion that existed from 1988 through 2001. It began as a promotion affiliated with the National Wrestling Alliance (NWA) that appeared on the national scene under the ownership of media mogul Ted Turner and based in Atlanta, Georgia. The name came from a wrestling television program that aired on TBS in the 1980s, which had taken the name from an Australian wrestling promotion of the 1970s. In the 1990s, World Championship Wrestling, along with the World Wrestling Federation, the WWF, were the top two wrestling promotions in the United States. Its flagship show, WCW Monday Night Raw, went head-to-head with WWF Raw's War in a ratings battle known as the Monday Night Wars. However, lackluster storylines, the increasing popularity of the WWF's Attitude Era, interference and restrictions from Time Warner eventually led to its decline and eventual acquisition of key assets by its main competition, Vince McMahon and the WWF, now known as the WWE. Although World Championship Wrestling was a brand name used by promoter Jim Burnett for his Australian promotion, the first promotion in the United States to use the World Championship Wrestling brand name, though it was never referred to as WCW on a wide scale, was Georgia Championship Wrestling, known as GCW. Owned primarily by Jack Briscoe and Gerald Briscoe and booked by Ole Anderson, was the first NWA territory to gain cable television access. Being broadcast on Channel 17 of Ted Turner's Superstation TBS, the show was broadcast every Saturday evening from 6:05 p.m. EST to 8:05 p.m. Estate. After founding his own company, Titan Sports Inc. in 1982, Vincent K. McMahon purchased his father's Capital Wrestling Corporation (CWC) and merged it into Titan Sports Inc. Under his leadership, the World Wrestling Federation (WWF) became the top promotion in North America, and GCW devised the name World Championship Wrestling in an effort to compete. In 1982, GCW changed the name of its television show and thus its public face to World Championship Wrestling, since it was already starting to run shows in neutral territories such as Ohio, Pennsylvania and Michigan. These efforts helped to keep GCW competitive against the WWF, as both promotions had secured television deals and were trying to become national, as opposed to regional, entities. The change in name helped make GCW the top promotion once again, until the WWF was able to officially leave the NWA and create the show WWF All-American Wrestling. The NWA, led by the president of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, Jim Crockett, Jr., countered by creating Starrcade in the fall of '83, the main event of which featured Ric Flair defeating Harley Race in a critically acclaimed steel cage match to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, which he would hold on 9 separate occasions. The success of Starrcade would elevate Flair to superstar status. He would become the franchise player of Jim Crockett Promotions and is largely responsible for the success of JCP during the mid to late '80s. The success of Starrcade would also succeed in propelling the NWA back to the top, but Vince McMahon again regained the lead with Hulk Hogan's dramatic world title victory at Madison Square Garden on January 23, 1984, as well as the creation of the television show Tuesday Night Titans. On April 9, 1984, the Briscoe brothers sold their shares in GCW, including their prime-time slot on the TBS cable television network, to Vince McMahon. However, GCW's core audience was not interested in the WWF's gimmick-based approach, preferring a more athletic style. As a result, when GCW's television viewers tuned into TBS on July 14, 1984 and saw WWF programming instead, they were outraged and sent complaints to the network demanding the return of GCW. This day has since gone down in wrestling lore as Black Saturday. Adding fuel to the fire was the fact that, despite originally promising to produce original programming for the TBS time slot, McMahon chose instead to provide only a clip show for TBS featuring highlights from other WWF programming, a move which angered network head Ted Turner and was a major factor in his decision to discontinue showing the WWF on his network. Luckily for Turner, Ole Anderson had refused to sell his shares in GCW to the WWF, and he teamed with fellow holdout shareholders Fred Ward and Ralph Freed to create Championship Wrestling from Georgia. Turner quickly secured a television deal with the new promotion, as well as with Bill Watts, Mid-South Wrestling based in Oklahoma. In March 1985, McMahon sold his TBS time slot and the World Championship Wrestling, named to Jim Crockett Promotions JCP, owned by Jim Crockett, Jr., under pressure from Ted Turner. The WWF and its major superstar, Hulk Hogan, however, were now the superior figures of wrestling after the success of the first WrestleMania, so the sale took place to successfully put the company in better shape. The new WCW, which was now a combination of JCP Mid-Atlantic Wrestling and Championship Wrestling from Georgia, was now the top show on TBS, and Jim Crockett, Jr. became NWA president for the second time. By 1986, Jim Crockett Promotions controlled key portions of the NWA, including the traditional NWA territories in North and South Carolina, Georgia, and St. Louis, thanks in no small part to the success of the Jim Crockett Sr. Memorial Cup, which showcased talent from various NWA territories, as well as a working cross-promotional relationship with Vern Gainey's American Wrestling Association. JCP merged its NWA territories into one group, promoting under the banner NWA World Championship Wrestling. This sparked a feud between Crockett and Vince McMahon's WWF, and the companies attempted to outmaneuver each other to acquire key television slots. It was the WWF, however, who was able to become a hit in St. Louis and the rest of Missouri as well, which brought trouble to the NWA Central States. The WWF was able to become a hit across the country as well, as the feud between Hulk Hogan and Paul Orndorff appealed to a large audience. Following this, Bob Geigel became the NWA president once again. In the same year, JCP also purchased Geigel's Heart of America Sports Attractions, promoters of the Central States Territory, which owned the rights to promote wrestling shows through the states of Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa. In 1987, JCP would enter into an agreement to control Championship Wrestling from Florida and Universal Wrestling Federation, which covered Oklahoma, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. By this time, the UWF had split from the NWA. This helped elevate Crockett to a third tenure as NWA president. The Florida and Mid-South territories, along with those companies' rosters of wrestlers, were absorbed into WCW. Jim Crockett Promotions now owned NWA St. Louis, the Universal Wrestling Federation, Mid-Atlantic, Central States Wrestling, Championship Wrestling from Georgia, and Championship Wrestling from Florida as well. JCP had almost accomplished its goal of creating a national promotion. Between the purchasing of several NWA territories, world-class championship wrestling in Texas, leaving the NWA in '86, and later merging with Jerry Jarrett's Continental Wrestling Association in Memphis to create a new promotion, the United States Wrestling Association, JCP was the last bastion of the NWA, and the last member with national television exposure. Although JCP and the NWA were still two separate legal entities, with Crockett as NWA president, the NWA was effectively reduced to a non-paper organization funded by Jim Crockett Promotions, and allowed JCP to use the NWA brand name for promoting. With the large amount of capital needed to take a wrestling promotion on a national tour, the various territorial acquisitions had seriously drained JCP's coffers. He was in a similar situation to that of the WWF in the early 80s. The large debt load, and the success or failure of the federation hinging on the success or failure of a series of pay-per-view events. In 87, JCP marketed the fifth installment of Starrcade as the NWA's answer to the WWF's WrestleMania event. However, the WWF promoted their first Survivor Series event on the same day. The WWF informed cable companies that if they chose to carry Starrcade, they would not be allowed to carry future WWF events. The vast majority of companies showed Survivor Series. Only 5 opted to remain loyal to their contract with Crockett, resulting in only an $80,000 profit after expenses. In January 1988, JCP promoted Bunkhouse Stampede, and McMahon counter-programmed with the first Royal Rumble on USA Network. Both NWA events achieved low buy rates, and the resulting financial blow led to the beginning of the end for JCP. The decision to hold these events in Chicago and New York alienated the Crockett's main fan base in the Carolinas, hampering their drawing power for arena shows in the Southeast. In 1984, Crockett had signed Dusty Rhodes and made him booker for World Championship Wrestling. Rhodes had a reputation for creativity and authored many of the memorable feuds and storylines of this period and gimmick matches like War Games. Also, Rhodes was responsible for elevating up-and-coming wrestlers such as Sting, Ricky Steamboat, Magnum TA, the Road Warriors Hawk and Animal, and Nikita Koloff, among others, to superstardom. By 1988, after 4 years of competition with Vince McMahon, and a long political struggle with champion Ric Flair, Rhodes was burnt out. Fans were sick of the dusty finish and other non-endings for shows that had obliterated the once profitable house show market. One of the last creative aspects Dusty Rhodes initiated was Clash of the Champions 1, on the night of WrestleMania 4. For a quarter hour, the Ric Flair vs. Sting match gained more viewers than WrestleMania. The epic match also made Sting a top player for WCW. By the end of '88, Rhodes was booking cards seemingly at random, and planning at one point to have mid-card wrestler Rick Steiner defeat Ric Flair in a 5-minute match at Starrcade for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. After Starrcade '88, Rhodes was fired by the promotion after an angle he booked on November 26. Where Road Warrior Animal pulled a spike out of his shoulder pad and jammed it in Rhodes' eye, busting it wide open, despite a strict no-blood policy laid down by Turner after his recent purchase of the company. To preserve the inexpensive network programming provided by professional wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions was purchased outright by Turner on October 11, 1988. Originally incorporated by TBS as the Universal Wrestling Corporation, Turner promised fans that WCW would be the athlete-oriented style of the NWA. The sale was completed on November 2, 1988, with a television taping of NWA World Championship Wrestling that very same date in WCW's hometown of Atlanta. 89 proved to be a turnaround year for WCW, with Ric Flair on top for most of the year as both world champion and head booker. Flair helped bring in Ricky Steamboat and Terry Funk, and his pay-per-view matches with Steamboat were financially and critically successful. Young stars such as Sid Vicious, Sting, Scott Steiner, the Road Warriors, Brian Pillman, the Great Muta and Lex Luger were given major story leads and championship opportunities. 1990, however, would be an entirely different story, as Flair would be fired from being head booker in March 1990 after WCW talent began to argue that Flair was booking things in his favor. One of these examples was Flair's refusal to drop the WCW World Title to Lex Luger, as he had already promised to drop it to Sting, who himself had been injured earlier in the year. Most in the business agreed that Sting was a much better talent than Luger. Under Flair's booking, TV ratings climbed and had great pay-per-views. Flair was eventually replaced by Ole Anderson. Despite this influx of talent, WCW soon began working to gradually incorporate much of the glamour and showy gimmicks for which the WWF was better known. Virtually none of these stunts, such as the live cross-promotional appearance of RoboCop at Capital Combat in May 1990, the Chamber of Horrors gimmick, and the notorious Black Scorpion storyline succeeded. In addition, house shows were also dropping to record lows after Ole continuously pushed older wrestlers who were loyal to him during the shows. Behind the scenes, WCW was becoming more autonomous and slowly started separating itself from the historic NWA name. In January 1991, WCW officially split from the NWA and began to recognize its own WCW World Heavyweight Championship and WCW World Tag Team Championship. Both WCW and the NWA recognized Ric Flair, who was by now no longer the head booker, as their World Heavyweight Champion throughout most of the first half of '91, but WCW particularly recently installed company president Jim Herd, who was formerly the manager of the St. Louis TV station KPLR-TV and had also once been the regional manager of Pizza Hut, turned against Flair for various reasons and fired him before the Great American Bash in July '91 after failed contract negotiations. In the process, they officially stripped him of the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. According to Flair's autobiography, they refused to return the $25,000 deposit he had put down on the physical belt, so he kept it and brought it with him when he was hired by the WWF at the request of Vince McMahon. Flair then incorporated the belt into his gimmick, dubbing himself the real world's champion. On a side note, Flair eventually received his deposit, which with interest was over $38,000. WCW later renegotiated the use of the NWA name as a co-promotional gimmick with New Japan Pro Wrestling and sued the WWF to stop showing Flair with the old NWA World Title belt on its programs, claiming a trademark on the physical design of the belt. The belt was returned to WCW by Flair when Jim Herd was let go and he received his deposit back plus interest. It was brought back as the revived NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Meanwhile, the creative product of the company sank in '91 and '92 under the presidency of the inexperienced Herd. Ric Flair, who had conflicts with Herd, once stated that Herd knew nothing about wrestling, other than the fact that the station he ran had a hot show, referring to the once popular show Wrestling at the Chase, which was broadcast by KPLR-TV while Herd was manager there. According to Flair, Herd also wanted him to drop his entire Nature Boy persona, shave his head even though Flair's bleach blonde hair was one of his most recognizable trademarks, and adopt the Roman gladiator gimmick by the name of Spartacus in order to change with the times. This didn't sit too well with Flair and the creative committee. Committee member Kevin Sullivan was quoted as saying, "After we change Flair's gimmick, why don't we go to Yankee Stadium and change Babe Ruth's uniform number?" This backstage feud hit its breaking point when, during contract renegotiation, Flair refused to take a pay cut and be moved away from the main event position despite the fact that he was by far the company's biggest draw. He also refused to drop the title to Lex Luger as Herd wanted. Herd accused Flair of holding up the company. Flair tried to compromise to Herd and offered to drop the title to fellow horseman Barry Windham, saying that Windham deserved the title. Herd's other ideas included the Ding Dongs, a tag team whose sole gimmick was that they were obsessed with bells, the lumberjack named Big Josh who was accompanied to the ring by dancing bears, and the Desperados, a stable of bumbling cowboys. None of these ideas were received well by the rest of WCW, as they were seen by many as a poor attempt to mimic the WWF's more gimmick-oriented style, and Stan Hansen was so insulted by the Desperados gimmick that he left WCW outright when he was asked to be part of the group. Jim Cornette and Stan Lane would also depart from the promotion after having conflicts with Herd, thus breaking up the Midnight Express, one of WCW's top tag teams, and the Road Warriors would also leave in July 1990 because of conflicts with Herd. Herd was fired in January '92 and was succeeded by Kit Allen Frey. Frey's tenure running WCW was brief, and he would be replaced later in the year by Cowboy Bill Watts, who had formerly been the promoter for Mid-South Wrestling, later known as the Universal Wrestling Federation, and was the first head executive of WCW to have prior experience in the wrestling business since Jim Crockett left. '92 would also prove to be another bad year for WCW as well, as Watts would make top rope moves which were commonly performed by rising stars such as Brian Pillman and the Steiner brothers illegal during wrestling matches. This was part of Watts' plans to take the WCW product back to 70s standards, with poorly lit arenas and house shows in remote rural towns. This idea was not overly embraced by the rest of WCW after clashes with management over a number of issues, as well as feeling pressure from Hank Aaron over a racially sensitive piece of correspondence, as well as accusations of anti-Semitism from Paulie Dangerously and Scotty Flamingo, both of whom are Jewish. He resigned. He was subsequently replaced by Eric Bischoff.
Videotape trading and cable television paved the way for the decline of the NWA's inter-regional business model, as viewers could now see plot holes and inconsistencies between each territory's storylines. The presence of stars like Ric Flair on TV every week made their special appearances in each region less of a draw. The WWF left the NWA for good in 1983, as Vincent K. McMahon, who bought the WWF from his father in 1982, worked to get WWF programming on syndicated television all across the United States. That same year, Jim Crockett Promotions and the NWA created its primary supercard, Starrcade, the first to be broadcast via closed-circuit networks and was regarded as their flagship event. On Saturday, July 14, 1984, in what would become known as Black Saturday, McMahon bought NWA member Georgia Championship Wrestling, the GCW, and merged it into the WWF. The WWF would take over GCW's TV slot on TBS, which had been home to GCW's World Championship Wrestling program for 12 years. This move proved disastrous as ratings would plummet, and the WWF would end up losing money on the deal. Then NWA President Jim Crockett, Jr., the owner of Jim Crockett Promotions JCP, would buy the World Championship Wrestling program from McMahon for $1 million and returned NWA programming to TBS. By 1985, Jim Crockett Promotions JCP would become the flagship of the NWA by acquiring more time slots on TBS and merging with other NWA territories in attempt to compete with the WWF. With the success of WrestleMania 3 in 1987, the WWF would schedule another pay-per-view, Survivor Series, on Thanksgiving night to compete directly with NWA's Starrcade event, and demanded exclusivity from cable providers on carriage of the event. As a result, Starrcade was moved to December the following year, with the show now held around Christmas Day beginning in 1988. The WWF then scheduled their first Royal Rumble event in January '88 to counter-program against the NWA's Bunkhouse Stampede. The NWA responded by creating Clash of the Champions on TBS to counter-program WrestleMania 4. By 1988, Jim Crockett Promotions was facing bankruptcy. On October 11th, under the direction of owner Ted Turner, TBS got the assets of JCP and renamed it World Championship Wrestling WCW after the TV show of the same name. Originally incorporated by TBS as the Universal Wrestling Corporation, Turner promised fans that WCW would retain the athlete-oriented style of the NWA. The sale was completed on November 2, 1988, with a television taping of NWA World Championship Wrestling that very same date in WCW's hometown of Atlanta. By September 1993, WCW would withdraw completely from the NWA.
During the period that WCW operated with its own World Heavyweight Championship, while also recognizing the NWA's world title, Flair left the WWF on good terms and returned to WCW, regaining the NWA title from Barry Windham in July 1993. Immediately, the other, now smaller, member organizations of the NWA began demanding that Flair defend the title under their rules in their territories, as mandated by old NWA agreements. The title was later scheduled to be dropped by Flair to recruit the title change, which was exposed by the pre-taping of matches at the Disney MGM studios, known as the Disney tapings. The NWA Board of Directors, working separately from WCW, objected to the title being changed without their vote, and WCW finally left the NWA for good again in September 1993. WCW still legally owned and used the actual belt which represented the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. however, and Rick Rude even defended it as the Big Gold Belt, but they could no longer use the NWA name. The title thus became known as the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship, as the World Heavyweight Championship as sanctioned by fictitious subsidiary WCW International. WCW claimed that WCW International still recognized the belt as a legitimate world championship. For a short while, there were essentially two world titles up for competition in the organization, with Sting winning the WCW International title, while Flair captured the WCW World Heavyweight Championship from Big Van Vader. The two titles were unified by Flair in a match on June 23, 1994, when the experiment was jettisoned. The Big Gold Belt was then used to represent the lone world championship in the company. It was used as such until WCW's closure in 2001, and for a time in the WWF.